I can solve it, the single father said. Step away from that board. Do you really think you're qualified to even read it? Billionaire Victoria Hale grabbed his arm, laughing from the
Solve it,
podium.
and I'll marry
Solve
you.
it and I'll marry you. As the challenge echoed, the hall erupted. 300 elite students immediately pulled out their phones to record the viral moment. The 300-pound night shift janitor, Preston, didn't flinch. His mop was still dripping dirty water onto the floor. To everyone else, this was just a pathetic old man making a fool of himself. But they had no idea that beneath his faded work jacket, he was holding an 11-year-old secret that was about to destroy her entire empire. Before we hear what happens next, where are you tuning in from today? Let us know in the comments. At 40 years old, the 300-pound night shift janitor moved with a slow, deliberate heaviness, pushing his yellow industrial mop bucket across the pristine hallways of Hall 100. The air in this massive lecture theater always smelled faintly of old paper, chalk dust, and harsh lemon-scented bleach. Tonight, however, the usual quiet of the midnight shift had been broken. Hall 100, the university's most prestigious amphitheater, was packed to the brim. 300 of the country's brightest students were crammed into the oak-paneled seating, their eyes fixed on the front stage. Camera crews had set up bright, blinding spotlights illuminating every dust mote dancing in the air. Standing at the center of it all was Victoria Hale. A billionaire tech mogul and an alumna of the university, Victoria had returned not out of academic nostalgia but to execute a highly calculated PR stunt. Her company stock had recently taken a slight dip, and her media team decided that a loud philanthropic gesture was the perfect remedy. She pointed dramatically toward the massive chalkboard that dominated the front wall. On the dark slate, a labyrinth of complex mathematical equations was written in exquisite white chalk, a notoriously unsolvable proof in algebraic geometry that had haunted the university's math department for over a decade. $50,000, Victoria announced, her voice dripping with a theatrical blend of generosity and supreme arrogance. The state-of-the-art sound system carried her words to every corner of the hall. That is my personal bounty. To anyone in this room, or anyone watching the live broadcast right now who can solve this theorem by tomorrow morning. A collective gasp of amazement swept through the crowd of elite students. Whispers erupted. Smartphones began recording. Preston kept his head down. He wrung out his mop, watching the dirty gray water spiral down into the bucket. He didn't care about Victoria Hale, however, his exhausted eyes couldn't help but drift toward the chalkboard. From his vantage point near the front rows, those complex strings of numbers weren't just abstract symbols, they formed a language he had spent years deciphering in the shadows. He was so deeply lost in thought that he didn't notice Dalton, the teaching assistant, stepping back. Dalton had been watching Preston's every move since the janitor entered the room. It was as if he was trying to hide a secret and was terrified that Preston might uncover it. But before Dalton could act, Preston, the overlooked janitor, spoke up, "I can solve it." The words weren't shouted, but his voice was loud enough to capture everyone's attention. Dalton stopped mid-sentence, his jaw dropping. The students in the front rows turned their heads, their expressions morphing from annoyance to sheer disbelief. Up on the podium, Victoria Hale paused. She slowly lowered her microphone, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows raising in amusement. "What did you just say?" Victoria asked, stepping forward as the camera lenses swiveled to capture the tense standoff. "Step away from that board. Do you really think you're qualified to even read it?" She tugged lightly on his arm. But Preston stood firm. "I can solve it." Preston's statement had just turned him into the center of a circus. But Preston's certainty made the teaching assistant tense up. He lunged forward, pointing a finger at Preston's chest. "You're crazy. You're just a lowly hired janitor trying to ruin my lecture hall." "Security! Get him out of here!" But Victoria immediately held up a hand. She wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. The PR potential was invaluable, a brilliant billionaire publicly putting a delusional, uneducated janitor in his place on live television. It was the perfect display of intellectual superiority. "Wait," Victoria commanded. The heavy scent of her expensive perfume washed over Preston, completely overpowering the harsh chemical smell of the bleach bucket as she stepped down from the raised platform. She walked straight up to Preston. She snatched a piece of white chalk from Dalton's trembling hand and turned her back on the janitor, facing the massive board. With a dramatic flair, Victoria reached up and signed her name in large, looping letters at the bottom corner of the board, right next to the unsolvable equation. "You think you can solve it?" Victoria challenged. She turned back to look at Preston, her voice amplified through the cameras, dripping with venomous sarcasm. She let out a sharp laugh, followed by a sentence she would later regret. "Solve it, and if you do, I'll marry you." The auditorium erupted. 300 elite students gasped in unison before bursting into loud, unforgiving laughter. Smartphones instantly shot up into the air, recording this exact moment. No one cared about the prize money anymore. They were entirely focused on this challenge and the views they would rake in once they posted the video of this ruthless showdown. Under the harsh, blinding light of hundreds of camera flashes, Preston stood perfectly still. His broad shoulders slumped slightly. He didn't argue. He simply fell into deep thought, ignoring all the people around him laughing at his expense. They laughed at his heavy footsteps, completely unaware of the truth. But to understand why this giant of a man accepted such brutal humiliation without fighting back, we have to look back at what happened in the janitor's break room the night before. The oppressive, suffocating heat of the cramped janitor's break room offered a stark contrast to the air-conditioned luxury of the lecture halls above. Tucked away in the forgotten, windowless basement of the science building, the cinderblock room constantly smelled of ozone, mold, and stale, burnt coffee. A single fluorescent bulb flickered erratically overhead, casting long, jittery shadows across the peeling linoleum floor. It was 2:15 a.m. the night before Victoria Hale's grand spectacle. Preston sat heavily on a cracked vinyl chair that groaned ominously under his 300-pound frame. His massive hands, rough, scarred, and calloused from years of gripping splintered mop handles and wringing out chemical-soaked rags, delicately cradled a cheap smartphone with a badly cracked screen. On the shattered display was a live video feed from a secure hospital webcam. The grainy, low-resolution image showed a frail 11-year-old girl lying motionless in a sterile pediatric ICU bed, surrounded by a terrifying maze of translucent tubes and blinking monitors. It was Lily, his daughter. Preston stared intensely at the screen, subconsciously holding his breath as he watched the weak, rhythmic rise and fall of her small chest. Through the phone's tiny, distorted speaker, he could hear the steady, mechanical beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. To any normal parent, it was a terrifying, anxiety-inducing sound, but, to Preston, it was the only lullaby that mattered in the world. It meant her damaged heart was still beating. It meant she was still fighting. With a heavy, shuddering sigh, Preston reached into the breast pocket of his faded blue work jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were soft and worn from being handled 100 times. He carefully unfolded it on the scratched formica table, smoothing out the creases with his heavy thumb. It was a hospital billing statement from Boston General. The black ink seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of his failure as a provider. Total estimated out-of-pocket cost for pediatric cardiac valve replacement, $26,000. Due date, the 14th. He pulled up the mobile banking app on his phone, already knowing the exact number by heart, but punishing himself by looking at it anyway. Available balance, $4,100. He had saved every single penny for 8 grueling years. He ate discounted, near-expired canned soup for dinner, walked 3 miles to work in the freezing snow to save on bus fare, and wore the exact same pair of steel-toed boots until the rubber soles completely separated from the leather. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. The American healthcare system didn't care about his sacrifices, it only cared about the bottom line. The university's employee health insurance, a modest, high-deductible benefit granted strictly to full-time maintenance staff, was his only lifeline. It was the absolute only reason he hadn't quit this soul-crushing, humiliating job. It was the only fragile barrier standing between his little girl and a fatal heart failure. He had exactly 6 days left. Just 144 hours to figure out how to cover the massive financial shortfall, or the hospital administration would ruthlessly cancel Lily's life-saving surgery, giving her scheduled operating room slot to a family who could pay. Preston closed his eyes, the crushing exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights crashing down on his broad shoulders. It must be known that before he was the most brilliant doctoral candidate in the mathematics department, a highly respected scholar. But ever since his wife died, he had to put his dreams on hold to take care of his sick little daughter. Yet here he was, reduced to a beast of burden, accepting daily, vicious humiliations from arrogant 20-somethings just to keep a basic medical insurance policy active. He folded the billing statement back up and carefully tucked it into his breast pocket. He was ready to completely swallow his pride. He would let the students mock his weight, his cheap clothes, and his cowardly silence. He would let trust fund kids like Dalton spit on his dignity every single night, as long as Lily could live to see her 12th birthday. But there was one thing Preston would never surrender. A piece of his soul that he kept hidden deeper than his own pain, a secret he guarded fiercely from the cruel world above ground. At 4:12 a.m. the campus was a ghost town. Preston pushed his yellow mop bucket into the vast, silent expanse of Hall 100. There were no cameras now, no arrogant billionaire tech moguls performing PR stunts. No mocking laughter from 300 elite students. Just the quiet, soothing hum of the ventilation system and the familiar, comforting smell of chalk dust. Preston parked his cart near the front row of the empty auditorium. He carefully checked the hallway to ensure it was completely deserted. Satisfied that he was entirely alone, he reached down into the hidden compartment beneath the black trash bag holder of his cleaning cart. His massive fingers gently withdrew a small, tattered blue notebook. The fabric cover was frayed at the edges, and the pages were yellowed and brittle with age. Preston opened it with a quiet reverence usually reserved for sacred religious texts. Inside, the pages were covered with handwriting of complex mathematical equations that were miles ahead of anything the university's professors were currently teaching. It was Maria's handwriting, his late wife. 8 years ago, Maria had been on the very verge of solving the impossible algebraic geometry proof that now covered the massive chalkboard. She had spent countless nights at their cramped kitchen table, laughing as she deciphered the numbers that had stumped the world's greatest minds. But before she could publish her groundbreaking findings, a sudden, devastating brain aneurysm had taken her from him. In the chaotic, blinding grief of the aftermath, a senior professor had callously claimed her preliminary research as his own, burying her legacy and taking the credit. Preston looked up at the massive chalkboard. The equations written there were the stolen, bastardized fragments of his wife's brilliance, stuck at a dead end by mediocre academics who couldn't begin to comprehend the true depth of her genius. For 8 long years, Preston had lived a secret double life. Every night, under the cover of darkness, he would stand before this exact board. He would pull a piece of white chalk from his pocket and continue her beautiful work. He would correct the university's glaring errors, advancing the proof line by line, unlocking the secrets of the universe that she had started. And then, just before the sun rose and the first students arrived, he would take his wet mop and wash it all away, leaving the slate blank and erasing his own brilliance. He was the mysterious ghost of Hall 100, a campus legend whispered about by bewildered professors who occasionally arrived in the morning to find fresh chalk dust and impossibly advanced paradigm-shifting calculations left on their boards. They had absolutely no idea the mathematical ghost they worshipped was the overweight janitor who emptied their trash cans. Tonight, Preston picked up a piece of chalk. He looked at the blue notebook, feeling the phantom warmth of Maria's hand slipping into his. He stepped up to the board and began to write. The chalk tapped rhythmically against the slate, a beautiful secret conversation between a grieving husband and the woman he loved. Every night, he wrote her legacy into existence, and every morning, he destroyed it to protect it from being stolen again. It was a painful, beautiful ritual. He accepted his role in the shadows, perfectly content to remain a ghost. That was until the following night, when Victoria Hale arrogantly signed her name next to his wife's stolen work and offered $50,000. And that is exactly why, when Dalton screamed in his face, Preston simply couldn't hold back the words. That is why the silent giant finally spoke up, triggering a 30-second clip that was about to spread like wildfire across the internet, threatening to burn down the entire academic establishment. Back to the blinding reality of Hall 100, the mocking, merciless laughter of 300 elite university students that day. Preston had made the agonizing decision to turn and walk away. He had chosen Lily's survival over his own fragile pride right after Victoria's challenge. For him, the guarantee of insurance for Lily was more important than gambling on a battle that could cost him his job. But as he heavily turned his body toward the double doors, his exhausted eyes caught a glaring, unforgivable detail on the massive chalkboard. Right next to the impossibly complex algebraic geometry proof, Dalton had been attempting to work out a derivative equation earlier in the evening to show off to the undergraduates. It was a pathetic, incredibly sloppy attempt. The young, overconfident teaching assistant had completely misunderstood the foundational logic of the second theorem, applying a basic List-Shear formula to a nonlinear problem. Preston stared intensely at the board. Without even realizing he was doing it, his lips began to move, silently tracing the correct formula, mentally correcting Dalton's disastrous mathematical butchery line by line. He didn't make a single sound, but his intense laser-like focus was impossible to miss in a room full of people watching his every move. Dalton, who had been sneering triumphantly at the retreating janitor, suddenly noticed Preston's unwavering gaze. His smug expression was instantly replaced by a sudden jolt of panic. Dalton's breath hitched in his throat. Only a very select handful of people in the entire university knew the dark truth, that the preliminary research for this famous unsolvable proof hadn't come from the brilliant minds of the senior faculty. Dalton himself had personally copied the initial pages from a brilliant deceased woman's notebook 8 years ago to secure his prestigious, high-paying position as a senior research assistant. A primal career-ending fear gripped Dalton's chest. He couldn't let this massive janitor get anywhere near that board. "Security!" Dalton screamed, his voice cracking with genuine unhinged panic. He lunged forward, violently shoving Preston's heavy mop bucket aside. A wave of dirty, bleach-scented water splashed aggressively onto the pristine marble floor, staining the hem of a front-row student's designer jeans. "I said, get this lunatic out of here right now. He's unstable. He's a threat to the faculty." 2 campus security guards, both heavily built ex-cops wearing tactical belts, immediately rushed down the center aisle, pushing past the confused students. They grabbed Preston roughly by the arms, their thick fingers digging painfully into the worn fabric of his blue work jacket. They tried to violently haul him toward the double doors, treating him like a dangerous, violent trespasser rather than a university employee of nearly a decade. The 300 students in the auditorium roared with renewed, bloodthirsty excitement. Smartphones zoomed in aggressively, the camera flashes strobe lighting the room, capturing every humiliating second of the physical struggle for their social media feeds. "Stop resisting, buddy. Let's go," one of the guards grunted, yanking violently on Preston's right arm, trying to unbalance the massive man. But Preston didn't fight back. He didn't swing his massive heavy fists or yell in furious protest. Instead, he simply planted his cheap rubber-soled boots firmly onto the wet marble floor and locked his knees. He stiffened his massive, 300-pound frame, tightening his core and turning himself into an immovable boulder of pure muscle, grief, and sheer will. The guards strained, the veins in their necks bulging, their faces turning a dark shade of red as they tried desperately to drag him. But Preston didn't budge a single inch. The thick, ropey veins in his forearms bulged against the security guard's tight grip. The loud, high-pitched squeak of rubbered soles against wet marble echoed sharply through the room. But it wasn't Preston being dragged. It was the 2 security guards losing their footing against his immense, unyielding weight. Preston closed his eyes tightly, shutting out the blinding camera flashes. "Hold it in," he fiercely told himself, his jaw locked tight. "Think of Lily. Think of the hospital bill. Do not fight back. Do not give them a reason to arrest you and fire you." The sharp physical pain in his arms as the guards twisted his joints was absolutely nothing compared to the burning, acidic agony of swallowing his pride. The cruel, relentless laughter of the students pierced his eardrums like jagged knives, tearing at the inherent dignity of a man who was infinitely smarter than every single entitled person sitting in that room. Dalton, watching the desperate struggle from the safety of the podium, felt a momentary surge of sick relief. He thought he had successfully eliminated the intellectual threat through brute force and intimidation. But the panicked teaching assistant had completely forgotten who was actually in control of the room. Enough. Victoria Hale's voice wasn't loud and she didn't yell, but it cut through the chaotic noise of the auditorium like a diamond-edged blade. The state-of-the-art acoustic sound system carried her single, authoritative word into the chest of every person in the lecture hall. The security guards immediately froze, panting heavily. Dalton stepped back, his face draining of color. The raucous auditorium instantly fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Victoria slowly, deliberately descended the wooden steps from the raised podium. The sharp clicking of her 6-inch designer heels on the marble floor sounded like the ticking of an executioner's metronome. She approached the group, her cold, calculating eyes sweeping over the 2 sweating, exhausted security guards and the unmovable, silent giant they were failing to drag away. "Let him go," she commanded, her tone bored but carrying the absolute authority of a woman who could buy and sell the entire university board of directors. The guards immediately released Preston's arms, stepping back quickly as if the fabric of his jacket had suddenly caught fire. Preston slowly, methodically straightened his wrinkled jacket, his breathing heavy, deep, and measured. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, refusing to make eye contact with the billionaire. Victoria stepped right into his personal space, entirely unafraid of his massive size. She used the pointed toe of her expensive silk pump to lightly, mockingly tap the puddle of dirty mop water on the floor. Then she reached into the pocket of her blazer, pulled out a sleek smartphone, and checked the screen. A predatory, triumphant smirk slowly spread across her perfectly made-up face. "You know, Dalton," Victoria said, not breaking her intense eye contact with the towering janitor, "my live stream viewership just spiked by 42% the exact moment you started screaming for security. The internet absolutely loves a good, pathetic freak show." She casually reached into her other pocket and pulled out the crisp, pristine piece of white chalk she had just used to sign her famous name. She held it out toward Preston, pinching it delicately between her manicured fingers like a poisoned apple. "You loudly proclaimed that you could solve it," Victoria purred, her voice dripping with cruel, theatrical amusement designed entirely for her online audience. "So prove it. I want to see the trash man do some high-level math. Dance for us, janitor. Show us your genius." It was a brilliant, vicious, highly calculated PR move. If he failed, which she was absolutely mathematically certain she would go incredibly viral as the genius, grounded billionaire who put a delusional, unhinged laborer in his place on live television. It was the ultimate, undeniable display of intellectual and financial supremacy. Preston stood completely paralyzed. He was brutally trapped. If he turned around and walked out those double doors now, the humiliation would be complete, total, and permanent. He would forever be immortalized on the internet as the pathetic coward who ran away. But if he took that piece of chalk and wrote on the board, he would permanently shatter the safety of his 8-year disguise. He would expose his true, terrifying intellect to the very people who had stolen his wife's legacy, risking his job and Lily's insurance in the process. The silence in the massive room was deafening. The only sound was the frantic, rapid-fire click-clack of hundreds of students texting, tweeting, and posting about the unbelievable, tense standoff unfolding right in front of them. Preston slowly raised his heavy head. He looked past Victoria's arrogant, mocking smirk. He looked past Dalton's terrified, pale, sweating face. His dark, exhausted eyes locked onto the massive chalkboard, staring directly at the stolen, broken equations that rightfully belonged to the woman he loved. Slowly, deliberately, his massive, calloused right hand reached out. Dark white piece of chalk looked incredibly fragile, almost comical, as it was completely enveloped by his thick, scarred fingers. He didn't say a single word. He simply gripped the chalk tightly, stepped around the smirking billionaire, and began walking with heavy, purposeful strides toward the podium. The collective shocked gasp from the elite audience was audible. He was actually going to do it. The janitor was going to the board. Preston stepped up onto the wooden platform, towering over the massive slate. He raised his hand. The chalk touched the board with a sharp, echoing clack, but just as he was about to write the very first brilliant, paradigm-shifting number that would change the mathematical world forever, a heavy, manicured hand firmly clamped down on his left shoulder. Preston froze instantly, and before he could strike his very first intellectual counterblow against the arrogant elite, a third player leaned in close from behind, whispering a single, chilling sentence directly into his ear that made the hot blood in his veins turn entirely to ice. The heavy hand gripping Preston's left shoulder didn't belong to a campus security guard. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Miller," a low, gravelly voice whispered directly into his ear. Preston didn't need to turn around to recognize the voice. It belonged to Arthur Sterling, the university's ruthless, highly paid lead counsel, a man whose entire prestigious career was built on burying academic scandals. "Let's have a brief moment of absolute clarity, shall we?" Sterling murmured. The lawyer's grip on Preston's shoulder tightened, a silent, vicious physical warning. "I know exactly who you are, Preston. I know exactly what your brilliant wife did for this department before she died. And more importantly, I know exactly what is waiting for you in room 402 at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. The heavy white piece of chalk in Preston's hand suddenly felt as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. "You make one mark on that slate board," Sterling continued, his whisper sliding into Preston's ear like a physical poison. "You write one single, solitary number that embarrasses my faculty on this live internet broadcast, and I promise you, I will personally see to it that your employment is terminated before you even reach the hallway. I will strip you of your employee health insurance retroactive to midnight tonight. I will make a single phone call, and I will make sure the hospital administration kicks that sick little girl of yours out onto the street before morning. Do you understand me, janitor? You are a disposable asset. If you write that number, Lily dies and it will be entirely your fault." The threat was utterly barbaric. It wasn't just a professional warning. It was a cold, calculated death sentence, weaponized solely to protect a stolen academic legacy. Preston's massive frame began to tremble uncontrollably. Not from fear, but from a pure rage. But as he stared intently at the dark slate of the chalkboard, the complex numbers blurring in his vision, Sterling's threat echoed sickeningly in his mind. "If you write that number, Lily won't have a chance to live." He couldn't do it. The brilliant mathematician, the devoted husband, the man who possessed an intellect that dwarfed every single entitled person sitting in that auditorium, he had to surrender. 300 elite students watched in breathless anticipation, their smartphone cameras recording every agonizing second of the standoff. Preston's arm felt like solid lead. He slowly, heavily lowered his right hand. He didn't look at the board again. He couldn't bear to look at the ghostly remnants of Maria's stolen work. He gently, almost reverently, placed the crisp, white piece of chalk down onto the wooden tray. The tiny, sharp click of the chalk hitting the wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. A collective, massive groan of deep disappointment and cruel amusement erupted from the auditorium. The elite audience had been promised a spectacular freak show, a momentary, viral distraction where they could watch a delusional laborer humiliate himself on live television. And instead, they just got a pathetic, broken man giving up. Exactly what I thought. He couldn't solve it. "That's just one man desperate for attention," Victoria Hale announced loudly, projecting her voice perfectly for the room's microphones. The lecture hall instantly erupted into vicious, unyielding laughter. Preston slowly turned around. He looked at the sea of privileged, sneering faces. He looked at Victoria, who was already turning away from him, completely dismissing his existence, as if he were nothing more than a smudge of dirt on her shoe. He looked at Dalton, who was practically collapsing against the heavy wooden podium in a wave of sickening relief, hastily using his expensive silk sleeve to wipe the cold, terrified sweat from his pale forehead. Sterling, the lawyer, had already stepped seamlessly back into the shadows of the auditorium, his face a chilling mask of cold, bureaucratic satisfaction. The threat had worked perfectly. The institution was safe. He walked back over to his yellow mop bucket. His large hands gripped the worn wooden handle with a quiet, desperate strength. He didn't look at anyone as he heavily pushed the bucket forward, his head bowed. He walked out of that room, taking the brilliant, world-changing secrets of Maria's mind back into the shadows with him. He believed that by walking away, by eating the humiliation, he had successfully diffused the situation. He believed that the humiliation was strictly contained to that single room, and most importantly, that Lily's insurance was finally safe. But what the silent giant didn't realize as he heavily pushed his cart down the empty, dimly lit corridor was that a smartphone in the front row had recorded the entire agonizing scene in high definition. And in the modern digital age, a story like that doesn't just disappear into the shadows. They thought Preston had given up. They thought they had successfully crushed the janitor's spirit. But they didn't know that a much larger, far more ruthless fire was already being ignited on social media. The sharp, sterile sunlight of the following morning did nothing to wash away the heavy exhaustion clinging to Preston. He walked out of the university's service exit, his massive shoulders slumped, the crisp autumn air biting at his worn jacket. His grueling 12-hour night shift was finally over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. Deep inside the right pocket of his faded jeans, his smartphone began to vibrate. It wasn't a single isolated buzz, it was a rapid, relentless mechanical spasm. Preston pulled the cracked phone from his pocket. The screen was an absolute barrage of notifications. The front row smartphone video from Hall 100 hadn't just leaked, it had been surgically, maliciously edited. The footage had been stripped of any context. There was no footage of Dalton's aggressive humiliation. There was no audio of Arthur Sterling's horrific, life-threatening whisper. The internet only saw a massive, delusional janitor arrogantly claiming he could solve an impossible equation, followed immediately by the pathetic, cowardly sight of him putting the chalk down and scurrying away like a frightened rat while a billionaire mocked him. The view count on the primary video had skyrocketed from 10,000 to an astronomical 2 million views in a single night. The cyberbullying was an explosive, uncontrolled wildfire. Preston's silent, defeated exit had been weaponized into thousands of cruel memes. The comments were a toxic river of classist vitriol. Look at this delusional trash man, probably fried his brain huffing toilet bleach. Billionaire CEO puts a psychotic janitor in his place. So satisfying, Preston's thick thumb hovered over the power button. He didn't feel anger. He only felt a crushing, suffocating wave of utter humiliation. He was a man who possessed a once-in-a-generation intellect, currently being publicly crucified by millions of strangers as an uneducated, attention-seeking clown. But he couldn't defend himself. To speak up was to risk his job. To risk his job was to murder Lily. He firmly pressed the power button, plunging the cracked screen into total darkness. He shoved the dead piece of plastic deep into his pocket. He took a slow, shuddering breath, violently forcing the agonizing humiliation down into the deepest, darkest pit of his stomach. He practiced a gentle, warm smile, adjusting his posture to look as strong and reliable as possible. He believed that by turning off his phone, he could shut out the cruelty of the outside world. He believed that the viral infection of social media stopped at the heavy glass doors of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. He was devastatingly wrong. It was 8 p.m. Preston had spent the entire day sitting quietly in room 402 watching Lily sleep. But when she finally woke up, the hospital room was suffocatingly quiet. Lily wasn't drawing in her sketchbook. She wasn't watching cartoons. She was curled tightly into a small, fragile ball on the sterile white hospital bed, her knees pulled tight against her chest. Her thin shoulders were violently shaking, her breathing ragged and irregular against the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. "Lily, sweetheart?" Preston's deep voice cracked with immediate terrifying panic. He rushed to her bedside, his massive frame dwarfing the small bed. "What's wrong? Does your chest hurt? I'll get the nurse." "No," Lily whimpered, her voice incredibly small and fragile. She slowly lifted her head. Her pale, delicate face was streaked with fresh tears, her bright eyes red and puffy. She wasn't holding her chest. Her small, trembling hands were clutching a brightly colored tablet, a device belonging to the teenage boy in the bed next to hers. The screen of the tablet was glowing. It was paused on a high-definition frame of Preston's face, staring helplessly at the chalkboard in Hall 100, right underneath a glaring, neon yellow caption, "Delusional janitor gets destroyed by billionaire." The air in the room instantly vanished from Preston's lungs. The sharp, clinical smell of antiseptic suddenly felt like thick, choking ash in his throat. "The boy, he showed it to me," Lily whispered, a devastating crack in her young voice. "He said you were famous. He said everyone was laughing at my dad." Preston fell to his knees beside the bed. His massive, calloused hands reached out, gently wrapping around her small, fragile ones. He couldn't find the words. The brilliant mathematician, the man who could process complex algorithms in seconds, was completely, utterly paralyzed. "You told me you were doing important math, Daddy," Lily sobbed, a profound, heartbreaking betrayal shattering her innocent voice. "You told me you were helping people with numbers. But they're saying you're just a janitor who lies. They're saying you're crazy." It was the absolute breaking point. Arthur Sterling's threat had forced Preston to swallow his pride. The mocking laughter of 300 elite students had forced him to swallow his dignity. The viral hatred of 2 million strangers had forced him to swallow his voice. He could survive all of that. He could endure a lifetime of being treated like invisible garbage to keep his daughter breathing. But seeing the absolute hero worship in his daughter's eyes shatter into confusion and shame, seeing the pure, sacred trust of his child broken by a stolen legacy and a billionaire's cruel vanity, that was a line Preston Miller would not allow them to cross. If he stayed silent now, he would secure her surgery, yes. But he would permanently lose her soul. He would teach his daughter that they were exactly what the world said they were, worthless, disposable trash who deserved to be stepped on by the wealthy and the privileged. He would be allowing Maria's brilliant legacy to die in the shadows, replaced forever by Dalton's stolen lies. The suffocating blanket of defeat that had pinned him down since last night instantly burned away, replaced by an absolute, terrifyingly cold resolve. Preston slowly stood up. His massive, 300-pound frame seemed to expand, filling the small hospital room with a quiet, undeniable gravity. He reached out and gently, firmly wiped a tear from Lily's pale cheek. "I never lied to you, Lily," Preston said, his deep voice rumbling with an unshakable, quiet power. "The math on that board, it belonged to your mother. And tonight, I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to prove it to all of them." He looked at the analog clock ticking on the hospital wall. "I have a shift starting in 3 hours," Preston whispered, his eyes hardening into solid steel. "And tonight, no chalk is going to be left behind." It was 11:45 p.m. The sprawling campus of the university was dead quiet, swallowed by the cold autumn night. The heavy oak doors of Hall 100 pushed open. Preston Miller stepped into the cavernous lecture hall. But tonight there was no yellow mop bucket. There was no industrial bleach, no squeaking cart, and no faded blue janitor's uniform. He wore a simple, clean, dark sweater. He wasn't walking with the heavy, apologetic slump of a disposable laborer. His massive shoulders were squared. His steps were silent, deliberate, and undeniably powerful. He walked straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked onto the colossal black slate at the front of the room. The chalkboard was exactly as it had been left hours ago. Dalton's arrogant, disastrously incorrect equations were still scrawled aggressively across the center of the board, an intellectual massacre disguised as high-level mathematics. Preston stopped at the wooden podium. He reached into the inner pocket of his sweater and carefully, almost reverently, withdrew a worn, blue-covered notebook. He placed it gently on the wooden ledge. He didn't need to open it. Every single stroke of Maria's beautiful, chaotic handwriting had been permanently burned into his memory for the last 8 years. He reached down and picked up a fresh piece of stark white chalk. Preston closed his eyes. He took a deep, centering breath. He didn't think about Arthur Sterling's vicious threats. He didn't think about the 2 million strangers mocking him on the internet. He only thought about the brilliant, radiant smile of the woman he loved and the absolute promise he had made to his terrified daughter just hours ago. He opened his eyes, and the ghost of Hall 100 went to work. When the chalk struck the board, it didn't stop. Preston's left hand moved with devastating precision, aggressively erasing the final 3 disastrous lines of Dalton's failed derivative. His right hand immediately followed, replacing the garbage with a breathtakingly complex sequence of Riemann matrices. The silence of the massive hall was broken only by the aggressive, rapid-fire clack-clack-clack of the chalk. He was in an absolute state of intellectual flow. The equations poured out of him, a beautiful, furious symphony of numbers and symbols. The chalk rapidly wore down against his calloused fingertips. A fine white dust cascaded through the air, settling thickly onto the toes of his dark boots. 15 minutes passed, 30 minutes, 1.5 hours. The colossal wall of numbers was nearly complete. It was approaching 2A. M. Preston was writing the final critical proof, the absolute undeniable key to Maria's stolen theory, when the heavy oak doors at the back of Hall 100 suddenly violently swung open. "Who the hell is in here?" a slurred, panicked voice shouted. Preston didn't stop writing. Dalton stumbled down the aisle. The arrogant teaching assistant was visibly intoxicated, his expensive designer shirt untucked, his hair a frantic mess. Consumed by a paranoid, drunken anxiety over his catastrophic mathematical failure, earlier that day he had snuck back into the university to secretly fix his work before morning. Dalton froze dead in his tracks halfway down the aisle. His expensive leather shoes squeaked against the polished floor. A heavy metallic clatter echoed through the room as Dalton dropped his keys. His bloodshot eyes widened in absolute, sheer terror as he stared at the massive silhouette standing at the board. The board was completely covered, and the math was flawless. "You," Dalton shrieked, a hysterical, drunken panic seizing him. He sprinted down the remaining steps, lunging violently toward the podium. "You psychotic piece of trash! What are you doing to my work? Security! I'm calling security!" Dalton reached out, aggressively trying to snatch the chalk from Preston's hand to destroy the evidence. But this time, Preston didn't lower his head. He didn't walk away. Preston's massive left hand shot out with terrifying speed. His thick, calloused fingers clamped down around Dalton's narrow, fragile wrist like an industrial steel vise. Dalton gasped, his drunken momentum violently halted. He tried to yank his arm back, but Preston's grip was absolute, unyielding stone. Preston slowly turned his head. His dark eyes were utterly merciless, pinning the terrified, trembling academic to the floor. "Do not," Preston growled, his deep voice vibrating with a terrifying, suppressed violence, "ever touch my wife's work again." All the color instantly drained from Dalton's face. His thin lips trembled violently, unable to form a single word. He realized in that horrifying second that the equations on the board weren't just correct. They were in the exact, highly unique intellectual fingerprint of Maria Miller. Dalton opened his mouth, preparing to scream for help, preparing to unleash the full, destructive weight of the university's legal team. But before he could make a sound, a dry, raspy voice echoed from the absolute darkest corner of the back row. "He won't need to call security, Mr. Dalton." Dalton flinched as if he had been shot. An elderly woman slowly stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't a night guard, it was Professor Elena Ruiz, the 71-year-old former dean of mathematics and the original academic advisor to both Dalton and Maria. Known for her severe insomnia, she frequently sat in the empty lecture halls late at night. She had been quietly watching from the darkness for weeks, observing the mysterious janitor who solved impossible equations in the dead of night. Professor Ruiz ignored Dalton's hyperventilating panic. She walked slowly down the aisle, her cane clicking softly against the floor. She stepped up onto the podium, pushed her thick reading glasses up her nose, and stared intensely at the towering wall of white chalk. Her aged hands began to tremble. A profound, devastating realization washed over her deeply lined face. She recognized this logic. She recognized this brilliant, chaotic beauty. It belonged to the greatest student she had ever taught, the student who was taken too soon. Professor Ruiz turned slowly toward the terrified teaching assistant. Her voice was utterly lethal. "You lied to all of us, Dalton," she whispered, her eyes filled with cold disgust. "This was never your work. It never was." "That's a lie," Dalton stammered frantically, desperately trying to pull his wrist from Preston's iron grip. "He's crazy. The janitor is crazy. He's making it up." Professor Ruiz didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Preston. "Prove it to me." Preston finally released Dalton's wrist. The teaching assistant stumbled backward, clutching his arm in terror. Preston reached out and picked up the worn, blue-covered notebook from the podium. He gently placed it into the professor's trembling hands. The truth had finally been spoken in the darkness. The 8-year-old's secret had been shattered, but Dalton backed away toward the doors, a hysterical, venomous laugh escaping his throat. "It doesn't matter," Dalton spat, pointing a shaking finger at them. "Sterling will bury this. Victoria Hale will bury this. You have no proof anyone will believe. The university will destroy both of you before the sun comes up." He was right. A confession in an empty room was worthless against a billion-dollar institution. To make Arthur Sterling and Victoria Hale pay, to force the truth into the light before 300 elite students and millions of internet viewers, they were going to need an absolutely perfect trap. It was 8 a.m. Hall 100 was absolutely packed to maximum capacity. The air was practically vibrating with anticipation. High-definition television cameras and hundreds of smartphones were already live streaming the event to the world. Victoria Hale, the billionaire alumna, stood at the center of the podium, radiating arrogant triumph in a tailored suit. Beside her, Dalton stood practically glowing with smug satisfaction, waiting to receive his $50,000 oversized check for solving the impossible equation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced into the microphone, her voice carrying an undeniable, entitled smugness. "Today we celebrate true academic excellence. We celebrate the kind of elite intellectual superiority that sets our institution apart from the—" She stopped. A massive, heavy silhouette suddenly stepped into the bright, blinding glare of the television spotlights. It was Preston Miller. He was back in his faded blue janitor's uniform, holding his worn yellow mop bucket. The entire 300-seat lecture hall immediately erupted. Cruel laughter, loud boos, and vicious mockery exploded from the elite audience. "Oh my God, the crazy trash man is back. Is he going to mop the floor this time or run away crying again?" "Get him out of here!" Dalton's smug smile widened into a malicious grin. "Security!" Dalton yelled theatrically, pointing at the massive janitor. "Remove this delusional." "I don't think so." "Mr. Dalton," an amplified, raspy voice echoed through the massive speakers. The crowd immediately fell dead silent. Professor Elena Ruiz, the 71-year-old former dean of mathematics, stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains. She wasn't just a professor, she was an academic legend. When she spoke, the institution listened. She walked slowly toward the podium, her cane clicking rhythmically against the wooden floor. She looked at Preston and gave a single firm nod. Preston didn't look at the mocking students. He didn't look at the sneering billionaire. He reached past Dalton, picking up a fresh piece of stark white chalk from the tray. With one massive, devastating, and incredibly violent slash of his arm, Preston drew a massive X straight through the center of Dalton's entire equation. Dalton gasped in sheer horror. "What are you doing? Stop him!" "Let him write," Professor Ruiz commanded, her voice cutting through the panic like a steel blade. Preston turned to the massive, blank section of the chalkboard. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He remembered the desperate beep of Lily's heart monitor. He remembered the brilliant, beautiful chaos of Maria's mind. Then he began to write. For the next 40 minutes, the massive lecture hall was trapped in a state of absolute, breathless paralysis. The mocking laughter completely died. The vicious whispers vanished. The only sound in the entire room was the aggressive, rapid-fire clack, clack, clack of the chalk against the slate. Preston completely immersed himself in Maria's world. He didn't just solve the equation, he absolutely demolished it. He constructed a towering, flawless wall of Riemann matrices, bridging the gap between theoretical physics and pure mathematics with a brutal, elegant efficiency that most tenured professors couldn't even begin to comprehend. The camera operators eagerly zoomed in, broadcasting the breathtaking display of pure genius to over 4 million live viewers. The internet wasn't laughing anymore. They were witnessing a miracle. Preston wrote the final undeniable proof. He lowered his massive chalk-dusted hand. He turned around, his chest heaving slightly, his dark eyes burning with an intense, unbreakable fire. He had officially stripped away his 8-year-old safety blanket. He had exposed his true intellect to the world. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Victoria Hale was staring at the board in genuine, stunned disbelief. "The math is solved," Preston said, his deep voice rumbling through the silent hall. But mathematics alone wouldn't destroy a brazen thief like Dalton. "It's a trick!" Dalton shrieked, his voice cracking in sheer panic. Sweat poured down his pale face. "He memorized it. The janitor broke into my office and memorized my work. He's a thief." "No, Mr. Dalton," Professor Ruiz said coldly, stepping up to the microphone. "You are." Under the unblinking gaze of hundreds of cameras, Professor Ruiz signaled to the campus security guards standing by the doors. They weren't there to arrest Preston. 2 guards carefully carried a small, heavy glass display case down the center aisle. It was the mathematics department's historical archive case. Professor Ruiz unlocked it with a specialized key. She reached inside and withdrew an old yellowing manila envelope. The flap was securely sealed with thick, cracked red wax, stamped with the university's official crest. The date written on the front in faded black ink was clearly visible to the zooming cameras, August 14, 2014. Before her tragic passing, Professor Ruiz announced to the completely silent room, "My most brilliant student, Maria Miller, submitted the first half of this exact theorem to the department for archiving. It has remained sealed in this vault for 8 years. Dalton physically recoiled as if he had been struck. His legs trembled violently. With a sharp, dramatic snap, Professor Ruiz broke the 8-year-old red wax seal. She pulled out a stack of aged, faded paper. She held the original documents up directly beside the massive chalkboard. The handwriting on the board, Preston's perfect imitation of his wife's unique strokes, was a 100% flawless match to the archived documents. The logic, the unique formatting, the brilliant structural flow, it was completely identical. "You didn't write this, Dalton," Professor Ruiz stated, her voice echoing with absolute authority. "You stole the unfinished half of this theorem from Maria's desk after she died, and you fraudulently published it in 2016 to secure your tenure track. You are an academic fraud." The lecture hall erupted into absolute chaos. The internet exploded. The live feed chat was moving so fast it was completely unreadable. The narrative had violently flipped. The viral billionaire PR stunt had instantly transformed into a live broadcast of a massive academic scandal. Dalton collapsed against the wooden podium, his hands clutching his head, his career and his entire life completely and utterly destroyed in front of millions of people. Victoria Hale stood frozen, her arrogant smile completely wiped away. She had just been broadcast globally, attempting to hand a $50,000 reward to a confirmed thief while mercilessly mocking the brilliant husband of the true author. Preston stepped forward. He towered over the stunned billionaire. "The equation is solved," Preston demanded quietly, his eyes locked onto the oversized check. "I want the reward. My daughter needs her surgery." The internet cheered. Dalton was crushed. The truth was out. But just as Preston reached his massive, calloused hand out to take the life-saving check from the stunned billionaire, the ruthless, cold machinery of the institution finally struck its lethal blow. The massive lecture hall was vibrating with the deafening cheers of 300 elite students. Millions of people online were celebrating the destruction of an academic fraud. Dalton was completely ruined. Preston reached his massive calloused hand across the podium to take the $50,000 oversized check. His daughter's life was finally safe, but a thick, perfectly manicured hand violently slammed down on the center of the oversized check, pinning it to the wooden podium. "I don't think so," a cold, grating voice announced. The cheers in the hall instantly died. Arthur Sterling, the university's ruthless, highly paid head of legal, stepped up to the microphone. He didn't look flustered. He didn't look intimidated by the 4 million live viewers. He looked like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Sterling ruthlessly ripped the microphone from Victoria Hale's trembling hand. With his other hand, he pulled a perfectly crisp, heavily watermarked legal document from his expensive leather briefcase. "This is the official, legally binding charter for the Hale Foundation Mathematics Prize," Sterling announced to the dead silent room, his voice dripping with condescending corporate authority. Sterling tapped a thick gold pen against the absolute bottom edge of the document. Section 4, paragraph B in size 8-point font. "The $50,000 prize is legally restricted exclusively to enrolled students and tenured faculty of this university." A collective horrified gasp echoed through Hall 100. Sterling turned his cold reptilian eyes toward the massive janitor. "Mr. Miller is an outsourced hourly contractor. He is not a student. He is not faculty. Therefore, he is legally ineligible to receive a single dime of this money." The live chat exploded in absolute unfiltered rage. The cruelty was staggering. Dalton, who was still slumped against the podium in absolute disgrace, suddenly looked up. A sickening, desperate glimmer of hope flashed in his bloodshot eyes. "He's ineligible," Dalton shrieked, scrambling frantically to his feet. He lunged toward the check. "I brought the equation to the board. I'm the faculty. The money is legally mine." The 300 students erupted in furious, deafening boos. The injustice was physically nauseating. A brilliant man had just mathematically demolished an impossible equation to save his dying daughter, and the institution was using an 8-point font technicality to steal the money back for a confirmed fraud. Preston stood in absolute silence. His massive shoulders didn't slump. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he simply stared at the cold, ruthless lawyer. Victoria Hale, however, was in a state of absolute, hyperventilating panic. Her assistant was frantically waving a glowing tablet from the front row. The live stream had just crossed 40 million concurrent viewers. The hashtag Boycott Hale was trending at #1 globally. Her company's stock was currently in a catastrophic vertical freefall, losing tens of millions of dollars in market cap every single second she stood next to Sterling and Dalton. "Give him the money, Arthur," Victoria hissed through gritted teeth, desperately trying to maintain a fake smile for the cameras. "Just pay the janitor, it's PR suicide." "We can't," Sterling whispered back coldly, completely unfazed. "If we violate the legal charter of this prize on a global broadcast, our other major donors will sue the university for breach of fiduciary trust. We are bound by the paperwork, Victoria. The law doesn't care about his daughter." Preston heard every single word. He slowly closed his eyes. A small, chillingly calm smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You want to play with paperwork, Mr. Sterling?" Preston's deep, rumbling voice easily cut through the massive, chaotic noise of the lecture hall. Sterling narrowed his eyes, a flicker of genuine unease finally cracking his arrogant facade. "Excuse me?" Preston didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Professor Ruiz. "If the institution demands legal paperwork," Preston said, his dark eyes locking onto the ruthless lawyer, "then let's give them paperwork." Professor Ruiz nodded slowly. She reached into her aged leather purse. She wasn't pulling out another sealed envelope. She was pulling out something far smaller, something that had been sitting quietly in her wallet for the last 9 years. Professor Ruiz held up a small, faded plastic card for the cameras. It wasn't a standard university ID. It had a thick blue border and the university's official seal pressed into the plastic. "This is a 2013 library access card," Professor Ruiz announced clearly. She slowly turned the card around. On the back, in faded ink, was the unmistakable signature of the university's previous president. "Read the handwritten addendum, Mr. Sterling," Professor Ruiz ordered. Sterling narrowed his eyes. The color slowly began to drain from his face as he read the faded text. "Full access to all university facilities granted." Professor Ruiz read aloud for the millions of viewers, her voice ringing with absolute triumph, "and lifelong honorary research fellow status officially awarded to Maria Miller and her primary co-researcher, Preston Miller." The entire lecture hall erupted in a massive collective gasp. "Legally speaking, Mr. Sterling," Professor Ruiz smiled coldly, "Preston Miller is not just an outsourced janitor. He has held the legal status of an honorary research fellow at this university for 9 years. He is faculty. Your 8-point font just made him 100% eligible for that check." Sterling visibly broke into a cold sweat. He frantically flipped through his legal pad, desperate to find a loophole. The institution was collapsing. "This proves nothing," Sterling practically shouted, his arrogant composure shattering into desperate, pathetic pieces. "It just proves he had a library card. It doesn't prove he's the one who's been solving the math on this board. He could have just memorized his dead wife's notes." It was the final, pathetic death rattle of a cornered predator. Preston simply smiled. He turned his massive frame and walked slowly back to his yellow mop bucket. He didn't pull out a mop. He reached into the bottom compartment of his squeaking cart and pulled out a massive, thick stack of folded dot matrix printer paper. It was a document that the elite academic institution had never once bothered to look at. Preston walked back to the podium and violently slammed the massive stack of paper down right next to Sterling's expensive leather briefcase. "These," Preston rumbled, his voice echoing like thunder, "are my official, automated time clock logs from the university's maintenance department. A fully automated, untamperable digital record of every single shift I have worked." Preston forcefully flipped the massive stack open. Row after row of red and black ink documented an endless sea of minimum wage labor. For 2,920 consecutive days, Preston stated, his massive finger tracking down the endless columns of data. "Every single night, my employee keycard was swiped into Hall 100 at exactly 1A. And every single night, my keycard was swiped out of Hall 100 at exactly 412A. The cameras zoomed in on the endless rows of data. The exact time frame, Professor Ruiz confirmed to the cameras that the ghost of Hall 100 was leaving his mathematical additions on the board before the sun came up. It was an absolute undeniable steel trap of data. Time, the most boring and dry metric imaginable, had just mathematically proven his innocence beyond any reasonable doubt. Dalton's knees buckled. A loud, sickening thud echoed through the room as the arrogant teaching assistant collapsed onto the hardwood floor. His eyes were completely vacant. He wasn't just losing his job, he was going to federal prison for academic fraud and theft. Sterling physically took a step back, his face completely pale. He realized in sheer absolute horror that if Preston decided to sue the university for legally harboring a thief and suppressing his wife's work for 8 years, the lawsuit wouldn't be for $50,000. It would be for tens of millions of dollars. The ruthless corporate machinery had been completely dismantled. Victoria Hale was cornered, with 40 million people screaming for her head online and her company's stock completely tanking. The billionaire had no choice but to swallow her massive, inflated ego. With trembling hands, Victoria unscrewed the cap of her expensive gold-plated fountain pen. The sharp click-clack of the metal echoed through the microphone. She leaned over the oversized check, forcefully crossed out the original number, and aggressively wrote in a new figure. She added a zero. She turned a $50,000 prize into a $500,000 PR settlement. Victoria forced a terrifyingly fake, painful smile onto her heavily contoured face. She picked up the microphone and held the massive check out to Preston. "Our university is always proud to discover hidden geniuses like you, Preston." Victoria lied through her teeth, desperate to salvage her public image. "Please, take this $50,000 reward. Your daughter deserves the best care." The entire lecture hall held its breath. 40 million people stared at their screens in absolute silence. Preston reached out his massive calloused hand. He gripped the edge of the cardboard check. $500,000. It was more than enough to pay Lily's $26,000 medical debt. It was enough to change their lives forever. He tapped his thick finger lightly against the massive numbers. If he took the money and stayed silent, Victoria Hale would successfully whitewash her cruel, classist mockery into a heartwarming viral charity moment. He had the money to save Lily's heart, but he hadn't yet reclaimed the most important thing for his late wife. Preston held the $50,000 check. Every single person in the room, and all 40 million people watching online, fully expected the impoverished janitor to break down in tears and thank the billionaire for her incredible generosity. Instead, Preston gripped both sides of the heavy cardboard. With a loud, violent rip, Preston tore the $50,000 check clean in half. The lecture hall gasped in absolute shock. Victoria Hale's fake smile instantly shattered. "I don't want your PR settlement, Miss Hale." Preston's deep voice boomed through the microphone. He threw the torn pieces of cardboard onto the wooden podium. He pointed a massive, chalk-dusted finger toward the very top right corner of the massive chalkboard. Victoria's arrogant, cursive chalk signature from the night before was still perfectly intact. "Yesterday," Preston stated, his dark eyes locking onto the terrified billionaire, "you stood on this stage and made a legally binding, public promise to millions of people. You said that whoever solved this equation, you would marry them." Victoria's heavily contoured face turned completely ashen. The live chat exploded in an absolute frenzy of hysterical laughter. 40 million people were screaming for the arrogant billionaire to keep her promise and marry the janitor. She had fallen directly into her own massive viral trap. "I don't want a marriage," Preston said coldly, completely silencing the room. "But you are going to execute a different contract to buy back your reputation." Preston stepped closer. His massive, imposing frame completely dwarfed the trembling billionaire and her ruthless lawyer. "First," Preston demanded, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority, "the Hale Foundation will pay for my daughter's heart surgery and her lifelong medical care in full, direct to the hospital. Second, this equation will be published in every major mathematical journal globally, under one name, and one name only, Maria Miller." Victoria swallowed hard, nodding frantically. And third, Preston turned and looked directly into the highest resolution television camera in the room. "This building will no longer be called Hall 100. Starting tomorrow, it will be globally rebranded as the Maria Miller Institute of Advanced Mathematics, and it will be fully funded in perpetuity by the Hale Foundation." Arthur Sterling's jaw literally dropped. Renaming a historic building and permanently endowing a mathematical institute wouldn't cost $500,000. It would cost Victoria Hale at least $10 million. But with 40 million people watching and her corporate empire actively burning to the ground, Victoria had absolutely no leverage left. "Deal," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking in absolute defeat. Professor Ruiz immediately slid a blank piece of paper and a pen across the podium. Victoria Hale signed her name, officially locking herself into a multi-million-dollar contract in front of the entire world. Preston hadn't just beaten the elite institution, he had used their own ruthless game of power and PR to completely bankrupt their arrogance. He had secured his daughter's future, and he had permanently carved his wife's name into academic history. The 300 students suddenly erupted into a deafening, hysterical standing ovation. It was the loudest, most chaotic celebration in the history of the university. The students rushed the podium, desperate to surround the absolute genius who had just mathematically and legally destroyed the institution. But when the crowd reached the front, Preston Miller was already gone. The broadcast abruptly cut to the university's hallway security camera. The silent, grainy footage showed a massive man in a faded blue janitor's uniform. He was quietly carrying a battered yellow mop bucket out the double-glass doors. His broad, heavy shoulders walked out into the brilliant, blinding warmth of the morning sun. He didn't look back. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the hospital room had been turned off. Warm, golden morning sunlight streamed through the window blinds. Preston sat in the small plastic chair next to the hospital bed. He wasn't wearing his blue uniform anymore. He was wearing a clean, comfortable sweater. Lily was sitting up in bed. The terrifying paleness was gone from her cheeks. She was giggling softly, drawing a messy, jagged mathematical equation on a piece of paper with a red crayon. Preston smiled, a real, genuine smile. He reached out and gently wrapped his massive, calloused hand around his daughter's tiny fingers. The heart monitor next to them wasn't beeping in a desperate, erratic panic anymore. It was beating in a strong, steady, and incredibly beautiful rhythm. Preston Miller never went back to Hall 100. The ghost had finally found his light.